The moment you start rising, someone will quietly decide you shouldn't, and the dangerous part is not that they exist, it's that you often don't recognize them until they've already slowed you down, confused you, or pulled you into battles you were never meant to fight. Because not every enemy comes with open hostility. Some come disguised as pressure, distraction, offense, even opportunity. And if you don't learn how to deal with them correctly, you don't just lose energy, you lose direction. David understood this early, long before he wore a crown. He was surrounded by people who underestimated him, opposed him, hunted him, and still he didn't collapse under it. He grew through it, not because he was stronger than everyone else, but because he was stronger than everyone else, but because he responded differently. That's the part most people miss. It's not the presence of enemies that defines your future, it's how you respond to them. David writes, "The Lord is my light and my salvation, whom shall I fear?" That's not a poetic line, that's a position, because fear is one of the first ways enemies control you without touching you. The moment you start reacting emotionally instead of strategically, you lose ground, and most people do this without noticing. They feel attacked, so they defend immediately. They feel disrespected, so they respond quickly. They feel threatened, so they tighten, they overthink, they try to prove themselves. And in that reaction, they step out of control. They start playing someone else's game. David didn't do that. When he faced Goliath, the entire environment was already controlled by fear. Everyone saw the size, the threat, the impossibility. But David saw something different. He saw a mismatch, not in strength, but in alignment. You come against me with sword and spear, but I come against you in the name of the Lord. That shift is everything, because he refused to define the situation by what was visible. And this is where most people lose before anything even begins. They define their enemy by how big the problem looks instead of how prepared they are internally. They measure themselves against the wrong standard. And once that happens, they've already accepted a disadvantage. David didn't wait to feel ready. He didn't negotiate with fear. He stepped forward with clarity, and that clarity came from knowing exactly where his strength was coming from. Not from himself alone, but from something greater than the situation. And here is where it becomes personal, because you are not losing to your enemies as much as you are losing to your reaction to them. The overthinking, the emotional responses, the need to prove something immediately. That is what drains you, that is what distracts you. And while you are caught in that, you are not building, you are reacting. And reaction never creates control. It only reinforces chaos. David shows something else that most people overlook. He didn't fight every battle. That's where people burn out. They try to respond to everything. Every comment, every criticism, every slight. But not every fight deserves your attention. Some are designed to pull you away from what actually matters. And if you don't recognize that, you will spend your energy defending things that were never worth protecting. David writes, "He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." That means even in pressure, he knew how to return to calm. And calm is not weakness, it is control. It is what allows you to think clearly when everything around you is trying to provoke you. And this is where most people fail. They let their environment dictate their state. They let noise become direction, and slowly, they lose clarity, they lose focus, they lose the ability to choose their next move intentionally. But David didn't lose that. Even when he was hunted, even when he was betrayed, he maintained something most people don't: internal stability. And that is what allowed him to outlast people who were stronger, more powerful, more positioned. Because in the end, ruling your enemies is not about overpowering them. It is about not becoming like them. It is about staying anchored when everything around you is trying to pull you off course. And that is where the real battle begins. Because the next thing David teaches is not about strength, it's about restraint, and most people completely misunderstand it. There's a moment when you have the chance to destroy the person who has been trying to destroy you, and what you do in that moment decides more about your future than any victory ever could. Because power without control exposes you faster than weakness ever will. David faced that moment in a way most people wouldn't understand, because it goes against every instinct you have when someone has wronged you. Saul had been hunting him, trying to kill him, turning the entire kingdom against him, and then suddenly David finds him alone, vulnerable, defenseless. One move and it's over. No more running, no more pressure, no more enemy. And the people around him pushed for it. They told him this was his opportunity, his moment to end it. And this is exactly where most people lose control. Because when the chance comes, it feels justified. It feels deserved. It feels like balance is finally being restored. But David doesn't move the way everyone expects. He steps back. He refuses, not because he is weak, but because he understands something deeper than the moment. The Lord forbid that I should do such a thing, to lay my hand on the Lord's anointed. That decision is not about Saul. It's about David. It's about what kind of man he becomes when power is in his hands. And this is where people quietly destroy themselves. Not when they are under pressure, but when they finally have the chance to respond to it. Because revenge feels like justice, but it often binds you to the very thing you are trying to rise above. You think you are closing a chapter, but you are actually extending it. You stay connected to the conflict instead of moving beyond it. And that is how enemies continue to control you, even when they are no longer present. David understood that if he became driven by reaction, he would lose the very thing that made him different. He would become just another man acting on impulse, justifying his actions by what was done to him. And that is a trap, because the moment your behavior is dictated by someone else's actions, you are no longer leading your life. You are responding to theirs. And response is always weaker than direction. Think about how often this happens in small ways. Someone disrespects you, and you feel the need to respond immediately. Someone questions you, and you feel the urge to prove yourself. Someone opposes you, and you want to push back just to regain control. But that control is an illusion, because now your energy is tied to them. Your focus is pulled into something that doesn't move you forward. And over time, that becomes a pattern. You start living in reaction instead of intention. David breaks that pattern completely. He chooses restraint, not because he lacks strength, but because he has control over it. And control is what separates leaders from reactors. It allows you to decide when to move and when to hold back. It gives you the ability to step out of situations that would trap you emotionally. And that is a form of power most people never develop, because it requires you to sit in moments where everything in you wants to act and choose not to. It requires you to trust that not every opportunity is yours to take, even if it looks like it solves your problem instantly. And that kind of thinking changes everything, because now you are not driven by urgency. You are driven by alignment. You are not chasing outcomes. You are building stability, and that stability is what allows you to move through conflict without being shaped by it. But here is the part people don't want to hear. Restraint does not mean passivity. It does not mean you allow everything to happen without response. It means you choose your response carefully, deliberately, without losing control. And that leads to the next lesson, which is where most people completely misunderstand how to deal with enemies, because they think the only options are attack or retreat. And David shows there is something far more strategic than both. Most people think the way to deal with enemies is to either confront them directly or avoid them completely, but both of those approaches can keep you locked in the same cycle if you don't understand timing. And David understood timing better than most people understand strength, because strength without timing creates mistakes, and avoidance without timing creates stagnation. There were seasons when David could have fought and didn't, and seasons when he stepped forward with precision, and the difference was not in his ability, it was in his awareness. Wait for the Lord, be strong and take heart and wait for the Lord. That line sounds passive if you don't understand it, but it is one of the most strategic principles in his entire life. Waiting, in this sense, is not doing nothing. It is refusing to move before the moment is right. And this is where people constantly sabotage themselves. They feel pressure, so they act early. They feel attacked, so they respond immediately. They feel opportunity, so they rush into it without testing it. And every time they do that, they step out of alignment. They make decisions that feel right in the moment, but create problems they didn't anticipate, because they moved based on emotion instead of clarity. David did the opposite. Before he moved, he asked, "Shall I go and attack?" He didn't assume. He didn't react. He checked direction first. And that small difference is what kept him from walking into traps that would have ended everything before it even began. Think about how often you move without that pause. You feel something and you act on it. You get an idea and you jump into it. You experience pressure and you try to relieve it immediately. But relief is not the same as resolution. And when you act just to remove discomfort, you often create something worse. David avoided that by creating space between impulse and action. And that space is where control lives. It's where clarity forms. It's where you see things that are not obvious when you are moving too fast. Because enemies don't always attack directly. Sometimes they create conditions that make you destroy your own position. They provoke you into reacting. They distract you with something that looks urgent. They pressure you into decisions that weaken you long-term. And if you don't recognize that, you will think you are fighting them, when in reality, you are helping them. That is the trap. You become part of the problem you are trying to solve. David never rushed into that. He slowed down when it mattered most. Not out of fear, but out of control. And that is a level of discipline most people never reach, because it feels uncomfortable to wait when everything around you is telling you to act. But that discomfort is necessary. It filters out the noise. It separates what feels urgent from what actually matters. And when you move from that place, your actions carry weight. They are not scattered. They are not reactive. They are precise. But here is where it becomes even more challenging. Because even if you master timing, even if you stop reacting impulsively, there is another layer that can quietly undermine everything you build, and it doesn't come from outside. It comes from inside. Pride. Not the obvious kind. The subtle kind that convinces you that because you have succeeded in one area, you are now protected in all others. And that is where David himself nearly lost everything, because the next lesson is not about how to defeat your enemies, but how to not become your own. The most dangerous enemy you will ever face is the one that doesn't look like an enemy at all, because it feels like confidence, like momentum, like you finally reached a place where you can relax your guard, and that is exactly when everything becomes vulnerable. David reached that point. After battles, after victories, after proving himself again and again, there was a moment when nothing external was pressing him, nothing was forcing him, nothing was demanding discipline in the same way as before. And that is when the shift happened. In the spring, at the time when kings go off to war, David remained in Jerusalem. That line is easy to read past, but it explains everything. He stepped out of his position, not dramatically, quietly. He stayed back when he should have been moving forward. And in that small decision, the structure that had protected him began to weaken. Because position is not just where you are physically, it is where you are aligned. It is the standard you maintain when no one is watching. And the moment you step out of it, even slightly, you create space for things that were never meant to enter your life. What followed was not random. It was a chain reaction. Then David saw a woman bathing, and he sent and took her. One moment of misalignment opened the door to a sequence that escalated beyond control. Not because he intended it, but because he allowed the first break to happen. And this is where most people fail without realizing it. They don't fall because of one big decision. They fall because of a small shift they didn't take seriously. A moment where they relaxed when they should have stayed sharp. a choice where they followed impulse instead of structure. And because nothing immediately collapsed, they assumed it was fine. But consequences don't always show up instantly. Sometimes they build quietly until they reach a point where they can't be ignored. David didn't lose everything in one moment. He lost alignment first. And once that happened, everything else followed. Think about how this shows up in your own life. The areas where you used to be disciplined but started to loosen. The standards you held but began to negotiate. The routines that kept you stable but you slowly abandoned because things felt easier. That is not harmless. That is the beginning of vulnerability. Because once your internal structure weakens, external pressure doesn't need to increase for things to fall apart. And this is why success often creates the conditions for failure. Not because success is dangerous, but because it makes you believe you can afford to relax the habits that created it. And that belief is what opens the door. David shows that even someone chosen, capable, proven, can lose clarity if they stop guarding their position. And that should reset how you think about control, because it's not something you reach and keep. It's something you maintain constantly, not out of fear, but out of awareness. And this is where the lesson becomes uncomfortable, because it means you cannot rely on past strength to protect you in the present. You have to stay aligned now. You have to stay disciplined now. You have to hold your position even when no one is demanding it from you. And that requires something deeper than motivation. It requires identity. Knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what you refuse to compromise, even in moments that seem small, because those small moments are where everything is decided. And if you ignore them, you don't just lose control. You hand it over without realizing it. But here is the part most people miss when they look at David's story. His failure did not end him, and that is where the next lesson becomes critical, because it shows what separates someone who collapses from someone who recovers and rises stronger than before. Failure does not destroy you the moment it happens. It reveals who you are the moment after, and that is where most people lose everything. Not in the mistake itself, but in how they respond once they see it clearly. Because once you realize you've crossed a line, once you understand that something in your life has gone wrong, there are only two directions you can take, and they lead to completely different outcomes. You can protect your image, or you can correct your position. And most people choose the first one without even thinking about it. They hide it, they justify it, they minimize it, they shift blame, they try to move on as if nothing happened. And in doing that, they lock themselves into the consequence, because what you refuse to confront, you cannot change. David didn't do that. When Nathan confronted him, he didn't argue, he didn't deflect, he didn't explain. He stopped. I have sinned against the Lord. That moment is everything, because it breaks the pattern immediately. It interrupts the cycle before it can continue. And this is where people misunderstand repentance. They think it's about feeling bad, about regret, about emotion. It's not. It's about clarity and ownership. Seeing exactly what you did without distortion, without excuse, without softening it, and deciding that it ends there, that you do not carry it forward into the next decision. And that is one of the hardest things to do, because it requires you to drop the version of yourself you were trying to protect. It requires you to admit that you were wrong, not partially, not conditionally, but completely. And that level of honesty is rare, but it is also what creates real change. David writes later, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." That is not a performance. That is a reset. It is a request for alignment, for clarity, for structure to be restored internally so that what happened does not repeat. And this is what separates people who recover from people who spiral, the willingness to stop the pattern immediately instead of managing its consequences over time. Because once you start managing instead of correcting, you are no longer in control. You are reacting again. You are trying to contain something that should have been removed, and that drains you. It keeps you focused on damage instead of direction. But when you correct it at the root, you regain control. You restore alignment. And from that point, your next actions begin to rebuild what was weakened, not instantly, but steadily. And that steadiness is what creates strength again. But here is where it gets even sharper, because even after correction, even after clarity, there is still something that determines whether you rise above your enemies or fall back into the same cycle. And it has nothing to do with them. It has everything to do with what you choose to focus on from that point forward. Because attention is direction, and whatever you fix your attention on begins to shape your actions, your decisions, and ultimately, your outcome. And if you are not intentional about that, you can correct one mistake and still drift back into the same patterns that created it. And that is why the final lesson matters more than everything that came before it. You don't rule your enemies when they disappear. You rule them when they no longer control your direction, your emotions, or your decisions. And that only happens when your focus is no longer anchored to them, but to something higher than the conflict itself. Because as long as your attention is fixed on what they did, what they said, how they moved against you, you are still orbiting the same problem, just from a different position. David understood this in a way that most people never reach, because he shifted his focus away from the enemy long before the situation was resolved. One thing I ask from the Lord, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. That is not escape. That is priority. It is a decision about what defines his direction regardless of what is happening around him. And this is where everything changes. Because the moment your focus is no longer reactive, your decisions become intentional again. You stop adjusting your life based on what others are doing. You stop measuring your progress against their actions. You stop carrying their presence into every thought and every move. And that release is what gives you control back, not because they are gone, but because they no longer determine anything about how you move forward. Most people never get there. They win arguments, but stay trapped in the mindset that created them. They move past situations, but keep replaying them internally. They distance themselves physically, but stay connected mentally. And that connection continues to drain them long after the conflict is ended. David breaks that completely. He anchors his attention in something that stabilizes him beyond the situation, and that is what allows him to move forward without carrying the weight of what happened. Because focus is not neutral. It builds direction. It determines what you reinforce every day. And if your focus is scattered, reactive, tied to what is happening around you, your life will reflect that. But if your focus is anchored, deliberate, aligned with something higher, your actions begin to follow that stability. And this is where ruling your enemies becomes real. Not in overpowering them, not in proving something to them, not in winning against them, but in outgrowing the space where they had influence over you. Because once you move beyond that, they no longer have access to your decisions, your attention, or your future. And that is the level most people never reach, because it requires letting go of the need to respond, the need to prove, the need to settle things on your terms. It requires trusting that moving forward is more powerful than staying engaged. And that trust is not easy, because it goes against the instinct to close every loop, to finish every conflict, to make sure everything is resolved. But not everything needs to be resolved, for you to move forward. Some things lose power the moment you stop feeding them attention. And once you understand that, your strategy changes completely. You stop trying to win every battle, and you start building a life that is no longer affected by them. And that is the shift that separates people who stay in conflict from those who rise above it. Because at the end of this, the question is not who stood against you. It is what in you remained unchanged because of it. Did it pull you into reaction, or did it sharpen your control? Did it distract you, or did it refine your focus? Did it lower your standard, or did it strengthen your identity? Because whatever it did, that is what you carry forward. And that is what determines whether your enemies had any real power over you at all. And now you are at a point where you see it clearly. The battles were never just external. They were internal decisions playing out under pressure. And if those decisions change, everything changes. Which means from this moment forward, how you respond is no longer automatic. It is chosen. And once it is chosen deliberately, consistently, aligned with who you decide to be, that is where control becomes permanent. That is where influence shifts. That is where you stop reacting to your enemies and start moving in a direction they can no longer kill.